Hi, let's talk about the fundamentals of exercise for nutrition, or what I like to call what to eat, when, and why. This is from module 4.5 in your textbook. But first, a public service announcement for those of you who are planning on becoming physically active. If you're not already active, just a caution. Please start slowly. This is not a no pain, no gain effort. I don't want you to be a hero. I want you to be able to be active and stay active. Pay attention to those body signals. Pain usually means something's not right, and you should listen to those signals. And please check with your primary care physician if needed. If you haven't been active or if you have been injured, make sure you're in the right shape so that you can stay in shape. Oh, yes, and let's just review a little bit from Dr. Desa from the Khan Academy. Fitness requires physical activity or exercise. And for those of you who hate the word exercise, I know a lot of people that do, I refer to it as a body in motion as opposed to a body at rest. The components of fitness include aerobic, or what the book refers to as cardiorespiratory, resistance, or strength, and stretching, or flexibility. And this is the fitness program that was described in the video. I love how he did this. And I especially love how he made sure that you pay attention to water, to staying hydrated, a topic that we'll spend more time in class on, that you dress correctly for the weather, and that this is supposed to be your brain, that you use the right judgment. Although I think he spelled judgment wrong. This is a type of slide I refer to as a busy slide. There's just too much information on it. But that happens to be the case when we talk about the value of exercise. And if you take some time and go through this slide, if you can find one or two of them that gets you motivated to start moving, then I'm glad that I included this. Let's talk about what to eat, when, and why. In the next few minutes, we'll talk about the fuels and the utilization of those fuels during aerobic and anaerobic exercise or activity. We'll talk about ATP and creatine phosphate and the macronutrients involved in activity: carbohydrates, fats, and proteins. First, let's talk about ATP. ATP is produced primarily from carbohydrate and fat during exercise. As the intensity increases, the percentage of carbohydrates used to produce ATP increases. That's why carbohydrates are the most important nutrient you should consume as part of your diet when you are training or just planning on being physically active. Nutrition supplies those fuels in the form of carbohydrate, fat, and protein that form ATP. ATP is generated through the processes of glycolysis, what's called the citric acid cycle, and what's called the electron transport chain. And please don't faint because you are not asked to remember what's on this slide. What I do want you to notice is that we have what's called an anaerobic section and an aerobic section. Anaerobic or glycolysis is the breakdown of energy in the absence of oxygen. We'll talk about how lactic acid is formed. And in the presence of oxygen during aerobic exercise or aerobic activity, the mitochondria, or that powerhouse of the cell, is used to produce lots and lots of ATP. Right here. How is ATP formed? We have glycogen in the liver and the muscle that's broken down into glucose, and from glucose in the blood, it goes into the cell and gets broken down to release ATP. Again, we'll talk about the difference between aerobic and anaerobic production of ATP, but lactate or lactic acid is used in anaerobic activity. And in the presence of oxygen, that pyruvate is then further broken down and produces lots of ATP. We have fatty acids from the triglyceride stores in our body that enter the cell and can produce ATP. And then we have oxygen that we get during aerobic exercise that is also very important in production of ATP. That oxygen from the lung is what distinguishes anaerobic from aerobic activity. Oh yes, so let's look at anaerobic versus aerobic exercise and where that ATP comes from. Let's start with ATP and creatine phosphate. ATP is also known as adenosine triphosphate. I've talked about how ATP is the energy currency of the cell. All the reactions that go on in our body either produce ATP or use ATP. It's an immediately usable source of energy. Our resting muscles contain only a small amount of ATP, enough to last about 2 to 4 seconds. So imagine if you're sitting, lying down, whatever you're doing, and watching this screencast, and suddenly an alarm goes off in whatever building you're in, and you have got to get out of there. You don't have enough time for the glycogen stores in your muscle to be used for energy. That takes more than 2 to 4 seconds. But because we have this immediately available source of ATP always present in our bloodstream, this is what your muscles in your legs are going to use right away as you start to bolt out of your room. As that 2 to 4 second store of ATP starts to decline, enzymes are signaled to start breaking down the creatine phosphate. Creatine phosphate is a high-energy compound in the muscle cells that act as a reservoir of energy to maintain a steady supply of this energy currency, or ATP. During short bursts of activity, if it's not running out of the room to save your life, let's say it's a 100-yard dash or some type of high-intensity, short-duration activity, what happens is that creatine phosphate is broken down into ATP. ATP is then further broken down and energy is released to allow the muscles to contract. During periods of rest, then what happens is that creatine phosphate is reformed. So we have a cycle going on here back and forth between the breaking down of creatine phosphate and the resynthesis of creatine phosphate. And when needed, this is the second source of energy after those 2 to 4 seconds of ATP that's found in the blood that our muscles will use for energy. After creatine phosphate, depending on the intensity and duration of the activity, the body will draw on carbohydrate first, then fat, and finally protein. We've talked about how the body doesn't want to use protein for energy, that it sacrifices all the other functions of protein if we're using it for energy. When we're talking about physical activity, protein is the least important source for energy. It certainly is important for resynthesis of muscle tissue, but in terms of energy, protein is not generally used to produce ATP. Maybe up to 5 to 10% of the energy used during physical activity may come from protein. But these three macronutrients work together, although one may predominate. And again, the one that predominates is related to the intensity and duration of the activity as well as the diet. It kind of makes sense. If you're on a low-carb diet, you're going to use up those glycogen stores pretty quickly, and they won't be available. These are some examples of activities that are fueled by glycogen stores or the glucose found in the muscles. These would be high-intensity activities, and these are activities that are fueled primarily by fat, ones that you can do for longer periods of time. We'll talk about how low-intensity, long-duration activities begin to draw on your fat stores. We'll first start with looking at carbohydrate or glucose use. We store glucose in the muscle as glycogen. The use of glycogen is affected by diet and the intensity of the activity. Glucose is a 6-carbon molecule that, as it's used, is broken down into pyruvate, or a 3-carbon molecule. What happens to this pyruvate? We have several options for pyruvate. One of pyruvate's options is the aerobic option. This is what occurs during activities of long duration and lower intensity, ones that you can do for long periods of time. What happens is that pyruvate can enter the mitochondria and gets completely broken down by those cycles, the citric acid cycle and the electron transport chain, and lots of ATPs are produced per molecule of glucose. But then we have the anaerobic option, which is what happens during short-term high-intensity activities. Pyruvate, a 3-carbon molecule, gets converted to lactic acid. This is the definition of anaerobic. In the absence of oxygen, pyruvate cannot enter the mitochondria. So this reaction occurs in the cytoplasm of the cell. It produces lots of ATPs very quickly, less ATP per molecule, but when you think about it, high-intensity activities must be of short duration. And so in the absence of oxygen, lactic acid is produced, And if you continue this activity, what happens is lactic acid will accumulate in your muscles. How many of you have experienced this? Think about it. You're sprinting, you're working at a really high intensity, and what happens is your muscles start to cramp. That cramping may be due to an increase in lactic acid. Your muscles can't take a high buildup of lactic acid, and that's because basically they're starving for oxygen. So what happens? You slow down. As you slow down, that lactic acid is able to break down and reform glucose. As you slow down, oxygen gets back into your bloodstream and is able to help reform glucose. So what's happening is that you have, glucose in the absence of oxygen is forming lactate or lactic acid in the muscle. That lactic acid is building up, and what happens is that you start to cramp, so you slow down. As you slow down, that lactic acid moves into the bloodstream. From the bloodstream, it goes to the liver. And in the presence of oxygen, glucose is reformed. That glucose can then go back to the muscle and be used for energy. This is called the quarry cycle, or the recycling of glucose. Anaerobic exercise produces lactic acid. Lactic acid produces a small amount of ATP. I'm not asking you to remember specific numbers. And then as that lactic acid builds up, you slow down, and low intensity activities clear lactic acid from the bloodstream as a result of the quarry cycle.